Since we did an overview of what Bootstrap can do, let's take a closer look at the grid system. The default grid system has 12 columns, which generate a 940 pixel wide container. If you enable the responsive grid system, you can achieve container sizes of up to 1170 pixels wide. Now, the good thing about this grid system is that it's customizable. So even before you download Bootstrap, you can customize the number of columns as well as column and gutter width. Consider a basic two-column layout. This is used very often in WordPress themes, where the left section has blog posts and the right is typically a sidebar. To build this with Bootstrap, we must first define a row, like this. We'll say div with a class of row. Now this will wrap the two columns. In Bootstrap, to generate columns, we must use the class of span followed by the number of columns. For example, span6 will generate 6 columns. And the markup is really easy. We just do div with a class of span6. Just remember, since we're using a 12-column layout by default, all these containers with the span class must add up to 12. So we can have combinations like 2 plus 10, 4 plus 8, 6 plus 6, and so on. Coming back to our layout, let's overlay a 12-column grid. We can see that the sections we want span on 8, respectively 4 grid columns. So the markup is pretty simple. It's going to look something like this. Inside the row, we'll say div class span8 plus div with a class of span4. Let's add some content and check out the result. So each big section is generated by a div with a class of span8 and span4. You also have the option to offset columns. That means moving them to the right by a certain amount by using the offset classes. Take this example. Let's do a separator here, and we'll say div class row, which contains a span 2 plus a span 6. So in total, we should have about 8 columns. Let's do span 2 and span 6. All right, looking pretty good. And as you can see, the width of these two containers combined equals the width of the span 8 container. Great. So what if we want to move this second container to the right? Well, we can specify the class offset followed by the number of columns we want to offset it by. So offset 2 will push it to the right by 2 columns. Offset 4 by 4 columns. All right. So next, let's talk about nesting, since it's a very important aspect of a grid system. It allows you to have sets of columns within sets of columns. Let's take the following example. We'll do a div class row. First, we gotta wrap this in a div with a class of span. Let's do a span 8. Level 1 column. And then we'll say div class span 2 plus div class span 6. And let's say level 2 column as content for both divs. All right, so as you can see, it doesn't really look much, let's add just a demo class to distinguish these two columns. Now, normally, these two should be aligned properly. They should be on the same line. And here comes a very important aspect of nesting. You must use the row class when nesting columns. So I'm going to say div class row. And I'm going to move these two inside the row. All right, so now we have a level 1 column and 2 secondary columns. The fixed grid is great for most websites, but there are situations when you need a fluid layout, like a web application or an admin panel. Bootstrap also offers a fluid version of its grid, which uses percentages instead of pixel values. And it's also responsive. So our initial static grid can be easily transformed in a fluid grid by appending -fluid to the row class name. Let's do that. So the first one, I'm going to say row fluid. And as you can see, the columns now span the entire available width. Offsetting columns in a fluid grid is also possible, and it works exactly the same as the fixed grid. So for example, if I change this row to fluid, the column is still offset, but it spans the entire available width. Nesting, though, is a bit different. In a fluid grid, each nested level of columns must add up to 12 instead of the parent column count. So here's an example. If we'll change this to row fluid and also change this to row fluid, you can see that the two level 2 columns don't span on the entire width of the parent. Instead, we'll do span 2 plus span 10. So they add up to 12. And now everything works properly. The grid system is great, but sometimes we need more control on how our website looks, particularly when we want to center it on the page. Coming up, we'll talk about the available layouts and some responsive classes.